She knocked on the door with bleeding knuckles because her fists had gone numb 2 miles back. Nobody answered. She knocked again harder, the kind of knocking that said, "I will die out here if you don't open this door." And when the heavy oak swung inward and a man twice her size filled the frame, she didn't flinch. She looked him dead in the eye and said, "I ain't asking for charity. I'm asking for work, and if you turn me away, that's your business. But it'll be on your conscience, not mine." If this story already has you hooked, please subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss a single chapter. And drop a comment right now telling us what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story has traveled. Now, let's go back to the beginning and find out how a woman the whole town had already written off walked into the coldest winter Colorado had seen in 30 years and changed one man's life forever. Her name was Margaret Whitfield. Most people called her Maggie, and most people, when they said it, let their voices carry a particular kind of softness that was really just a cover for pity. She had stopped tolerating pity sometime around her 28th birthday, and she was 34 now, which meant 6 years of teaching herself to hear the word Maggie as just a name and nothing more. She had walked 9 miles in the snow that morning. Not because she had some romantic notion about the frontier testing a woman's mettle. She walked 9 miles because the driver of the supply wagon who'd agreed to carry her as far as Harlow's Creek had taken one look at the drifts piling up on the road and turned his mules around before she could argue. He'd offered to take her back to Durango. She'd climbed down from the bench without a word and started walking. That was the kind of woman she was. The kind who climbed down and started walking. The Callahan Ranch sat at the end of a long private road, and she'd heard about it in a saloon in Durango 3 days before from a woman named Bess, who'd worked the kitchen there for 2 seasons before her knees gave out. Bess had described it with the reverence of someone who'd been fed and paid fair, and never once spoken down, to which was a rarer combination than it ought to have been, and Maggie had filed the name away with the particular care she gave to anything that might keep her alive. She needed a job. She needed shelter. And she needed both before the temperature dropped any further, because the cold that had settled over Colorado that January was the kind people described in lowered voices. The man who opened the door was not what she expected. She had expected weathered and tired. She had expected the particular blankness of a man who'd run a ranch alone long enough that hospitality had become a language he'd stopped speaking. What she got instead was sharp. Sharp eyes, sharp attention, and the kind of stillness that came not from indifference, but from a man who had learned that moving too fast cost him things he couldn't afford to lose. "You knock like you mean it," he said. "I do mean it," she said. He looked at her. Really looked the way people rarely did, as though he was reading something she'd written, rather than judging a cover. His gaze moved from her face to her coat, soaked through at the shoulders, to her boots, which had seen better years, to her hands wrapped in cloth she'd torn from her underskirt 2 miles back, when she'd finally lost feeling in her fingers. "You come from town?" he asked. "Durango 3 days ago. Harlow's Creek turned me out this morning on account of the weather." She kept her voice flat. Facts, not complaints. "I heard you might be taking on household help." He studied her a moment longer. "Where'd you hear that?" "Woman named Bess. Said she worked your kitchen." Something shifted in his expression, not warmth exactly, but a kind of acknowledgement. "Bess left 8 months ago. Her knees." "I know. She told me." "You a friend of hers?" "I met her once. In a saloon. She was honest about this place, and I've been in enough places where nobody's honest about anything. So I remembered it." Maggie held his gaze. "My name is Margaret Whitfield. I can cook. I can keep accounts. I can manage a household. And I can work without being told twice. I don't drink, I don't steal, and I don't cause drama. What I don't have is references, because the last 3 places I worked, the men who ran them weren't the kind who gave women like me fair letters." She paused. "I'm also aware that I'm standing in your doorway, half frozen, and that puts me at a disadvantage in this negotiation. I'd like to remedy that." Rowan Callahan looked at her for a long moment. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in," he said. The warmth of the kitchen hit her like a physical thing, not gentle, not gradual, but sudden and almost painful, the way warmth always was when you'd been cold too long. She stood just inside the door and breathed it in, and she did not let herself close her eyes, even though every nerve in her body wanted to. A boy sat at the kitchen table, maybe 8 years old, dark-haired with his father's eyes and a half-eaten biscuit in his hand. He stared at her with the uncomplicated curiosity of a child who hadn't yet learned to disguise his interest as indifference. "Who's she?" the boy said. "That's what we're figuring out," Rowan said. "Eli, go find Pete and tell him I need him." "I ain't done with my Eli." The boy went biscuit in hand without further argument. Rowan pulled out a chair at the table and gestured at it. Not warmly, but not unkindly either. More the way a man gestured at a chair when he was trying to be fair about something, and fairness for him was a physical gesture as much as a feeling. She sat. He poured 2 cups of coffee from a pot on the stove and set one in front of her without asking if she wanted it. She wrapped both hands around the cup and said nothing. "Tell me about the last place you worked," he said. "Rafter J outside of Pueblo. 18 months. I kept the house, managed the supply accounts, and cooked for 12 men." She looked at him steadily. The owner's wife came back from her sister's place in February and decided she didn't want hired help in the house anymore. That's the honest version. And the dishonest version. The dishonest version is the one the owner told people, which is that I was let go for incompetence. He told that version because it was easier than explaining to his wife why I knew the accounts better than he did. Rowan wrapped his own hands around his coffee cup. Before that, a boarding house in Santa Fe for 2 years. Before that, a mining camp cook for 1 season, which I don't recommend to anyone. Before that, I was married briefly, and then I wasn't. She said it the way she said most things, straight without decoration. "I'm not running from anything. I'm not carrying trouble with me. I'm just a woman who's been working since she was 16 and needs steady employment in a place that won't collapse under me before spring." The door to the kitchen opened, and a man came in older than Rowan by 15 years at least, with the bow-legged walk of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. He looked at her with an expression she recognized instantly, the careful blankness of a man deciding whether to be polite or honest. He chose polite. "Ma'am." "Mr. Pete," she said. Rowan stood. "Pete, this is Margaret Whitfield. She's asking about the household position." Pete's careful blankness didn't shift. "That's so. Bess mentioned the place to her." "Bess didn't send me," Maggie said quietly. "Bess mentioned the ranch. There's a difference." She looked at Pete directly. "You're wondering whether I can do the work. That's a fair question, and I'd rather you ask it than spend the next week wondering." Pete glanced at Rowan. Rowan said nothing, which Maggie noted was its own kind of answer. "It's a big house," Pete said carefully, "and a full crew. 9 men, Mr. Callahan and the boy. I cooked for 12 at Rafter J. Ranch work ain't just cooking." "I know that. I also kept accounts, managed supply orders, handled correspondence with vendors, and tracked inventory." She set her coffee cup down. "If you're trying to ask whether I'm capable of the physical demands, you can ask me that plainly. I won't be offended." Pete looked at her for a moment. Then something in his expression broke. Not open exactly, but the blankness gave way to something more genuine, something that looked almost like reluctant respect. "Can you manage Eli?" he said. "I managed 6 children at the Rafter J who were older and worse behaved than any 8-year-old. "Yes." "She's hired," Pete said to Rowan. Rowan looked at his foreman. Then he looked at Maggie. "I'll make that determination myself, Pete." "Course you will," Pete said, and walked back out the door. Rowan Callahan offered her a trial period of 2 weeks. He said it plainly without apology, 2 weeks room and board, and if they were both satisfied with the arrangement, they'd discuss wages. He showed her the room off the kitchen, small, warm, with a window that looked out over the yard, and he showed her the pantry, the supply ledger, the household accounts. She asked to look at the accounts that same afternoon. He hesitated. "That can wait until morning." "I'd rather look now," she said, "so I understand what I'm walking into." He handed her the ledger without further argument. She sat at the kitchen table while he stood near the stove, and she went through every page without speaking. The accounts were not in disaster. Rowan Callahan was not a careless man, but there were gaps. Supply orders that had been made and not received. Discrepancies between what had been invoiced and what the ledger showed on hand. 3 separate entries for feed purchased from a supplier in Durango that Maggie recognized because she had dealt with the same supplier at Rafter J, and she knew his invoices the way she knew bad poker tells. She looked up. "Your feed supplier," she said. "Harlan Brothers." Rowan set his coffee down. "What about them? When did you last do a physical count of your winter stores?" He was quiet for a moment. "November." "It's January." "I know what month it is, Miss Whitfield." "Then you should know that according to these invoices, you paid for 3 deliveries between November and December, but the quantities listed here don't match a full delivery for any of them." She turned the ledger to face him and put her finger on the entries. "You're either undersupplied, or somebody's been skimming the difference between what you paid for and what got delivered." Rowan walked to the table. He looked at the entries she was pointing to, and he looked at them for a long time, and she watched his jaw tighten with the particular control of a man who was angry and had learned to hold it inward. "How do you know what a full delivery looks like?" he said. "Because I ordered from them for 18 months at Rafter J. These numbers are short. Not by much, not enough that you'd notice without looking close, but short." "You noticed in an hour." "I was looking for it," she said. "Not because I suspected anything. Because in a new household supply shortages are the first thing that kills a winter operation. I always check." He looked at her. Not the assessing look from the doorway, something else now. Something quieter and more complicated than assessment. "Who was skimming?" he said. "The supplier or my man. I can't tell you that from a ledger, but I can tell you the shortage is real, and you need to count your stores before this cold settles in any harder." She closed the ledger. "Tonight if possible." He picked up his coat from the hook by the door. "You want to come?" he said. She blinked. In 18 months at Rafter J, the owner had never once asked her to come along on anything. He'd taken her information, acted on it, and never mentioned her name in connection with the outcome. "Yes," she said. "I'd like to." The stores were short by a third. Rowan stood in the cold dark of the feed barn with a lantern and a count that didn't lie. And the numbers landed on him with the weight of a man who knew exactly what losing a third of your winter feed meant when the temperature was dropping. And he had 40 head of cattle and 9 men depending on the outcome. He didn't say anything for a long time. Maggie stood beside him and also said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say. And she had learned long ago that the most important thing you could do for a man in that kind of moment was not fill it with noise. "I've got 40 cattle," he said finally, "and 2 horses that won't winter on short rations." "I know." "I've got 9 men who eat." "I know." "What would you do," he said, "if this was your operation?" She'd been running the calculation since she'd closed the ledger. "I'd send to Pueblo tomorrow morning first light. Not Harlan Brothers, a different supplier. I know a man named Garrett who runs honest numbers. He can have a full delivery out within the week if the roads hold." She paused. "I'd also cut the Harlan Brothers contract and document the shortage formally, and I'd ask your foreman Pete, who was present for all 3 deliveries." Rowan turned to look at her. "You think Pete?" "I don't think anything about Pete," she said immediately. "Pete was foreman. He may have overseen deliveries or he may not have. Knowing who was present isn't about suspicion, it's about tracing a chain." She met his gaze. "I'm not accusing your foreman, Mr. Callahan. I'm telling you how I'd gather information." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You've done this before," he said. "Not just kept accounts, solved something." "Once or twice?" "At Rafter J. Among other places." He was quiet again. Then he said, "I'll send Tommy to Pueblo in the morning. He's my fastest rider. If you want, I can write out the order specifications tonight. I know what to ask for, and I know how to write it so there's no room for error in the quantity." "Do that," he said. He turned away. She started toward the door. "Miss Whitfield," he said. She stopped. "Good catch," he said. It was not effusive, it was not warm, but it was genuine, and it was given without qualification, and that from this man she understood to be worth something. "Thank you," she said. She walked back to the house. The 9 men who worked Callahan Ranch met her the following morning at breakfast, and Maggie served them without ceremony, and watched them the way she always watched a new crew, not with suspicion, but with the quiet attention of a woman cataloging personalities, loyalties, and potential sources of friction. There was Tommy, 17, and eager to please and uncomfortable with silence. There was a man named Cole, 45, and methodical about everything, including the way he loaded his plate. There were 2 brothers from New Mexico, Diego and Hernando, who spoke to each other in Spanish, and ate with the efficiency of men accustomed to working hard and eating fast. And there was a man named Silas. Silas was perhaps 50. He had the particular stillness of a man who had made himself comfortable in small spaces. And he watched Maggie with a quality of attention she recognized from experience as something she needed to understand better before she could dismiss it. He didn't say anything to her that first morning. He just watched. She noted it and moved on. At 10 o'clock, Eli found her in the kitchen and sat down at the table without asking. She was in the middle of drafting the supply order, but she didn't send him away. "You're still here," he said. "I am." "Pa said you might not stay." She looked up at that. "When did he say that?" Eli shrugged. "Last night, to Pete. He said most people that come to the door in winter are just looking for a warm place to ride out the cold." "That's fair," she said. "Most of them probably are." "Are you?" She considered the question honestly because Eli was 8 years old, and 8-year-olds deserved honesty. "No, I need steady work. This ranch could give me that if we suit each other." "We suit each other," Eli repeated like he was testing the words. "That's how it works. I have to be good enough for this place, but the place also has to be what I need." She looked at him steadily. "Does that seem strange to you?" He thought about it with the seriousness only children could bring to a question. "No," he said. "That's how Pa says it works with horses." She smiled at that, a real one, not a polite one. "Smart comparison." He picked up a biscuit from the plate she hadn't offered him, but hadn't moved either. "He ain't mean," Eli said quietly. He don't say things easy. "I've noticed. He liked what you did about the feed." He bit into the biscuit. "He didn't say so, but he came in for supper and ate 2 plates, and he only does that when something went right." Maggie looked at the boy for a moment. "Thank you for telling me that," she said. Eli shrugged utterly without self-consciousness. Somebody's gotta. By the end of the first week, she had reorganized the pantry, established a meal rotation that the men ate without complaint, sent the Garrett supply order north, and quietly, carefully begun to piece together the pattern of the missing feed. It was not Pete. Pete had not been present for 2 of the 3 deliveries. The chain of custody, as she traced it through dates and notes and the casual comments men made over meals when they forgot she was listening, pointed clearly to Silas. She didn't take this information to Rowan, not yet. She needed one more confirmation, a specific entry in the November accounts that she'd flagged, but not yet cross-referenced, and she had learned through hard experience that bringing an accusation half-finished was worse than not bringing it at all. But she watched Silas, and Silas watched her, and between them ran the quiet current of 2 people who each understood that the other one knew something. On the 7th day of her trial period, he found her alone in the supply room. "You're clever," he said, "for a woman." "I'm clever," she said. "Full stop." He smiled at that. It wasn't a friendly smile. "You gonna be a problem?" She set down the ledger she was holding and looked at him directly. "I'm going to do my job, which means I'm going to make sure this ranch runs the way it ought to. If that makes me a problem for you, then the problem is yours, not mine." He studied her for a long moment. Women who come to a ranch door alone in January don't usually make it through the season. Then I'll be the exception, she said. She held his gaze until he looked away first. He left without another word. She picked up the ledger, finished her notes, and went to find Rowan Callahan. She knocked on the door of his office the same way she'd knocked on his front door a week earlier, with purpose and without apology. "Come in," he said. She came in, set the ledger on his desk, and laid out what she'd found in plain, ordered language. The pattern of discrepancies, the dates, the delivery records, and the specific entry that confirmed it. She told him that Silas had come to her in the supply room. She did not dramatize it. She did not ask him what he intended to do. She simply gave him everything she had and let him make his own determination. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "How long?" he said. "The pattern goes back to September, maybe earlier, but that's as far back as I've cross-referenced." 4 months. Approximately. He sat back, looked at the ledger, then looked at her. "You're 7 days into a 2-week trial." "I'm aware. And you've already done more than most people do in a year." She didn't answer that because it wasn't a question. "What do you want?" he said. Not as a challenge, as a real question, the kind a man asked when he was genuinely trying to understand something. She thought about Bess in that saloon in Durango, describing this place with her hands wrapped around a coffee cup and her voice going soft with something that wasn't quite nostalgia and wasn't quite grief, but lived somewhere between them. She thought about 9 miles in the snow and an empty purse and the cold that had gotten into her bones somewhere around mile 6 and hadn't entirely left yet. She thought about Eli saying somebody's gotta like it was the most obvious thing in the world. "I want to work," she said. "Honest work, fair wages, and the same respect you'd give any man who did this job as well as I do." Rowan Callahan looked at her for a long moment. "Trial's over," he said. She blinked. "You're hired. Permanent. We'll discuss wages in the morning." He stood, picked up the ledger, and headed for the door. Then he stopped in the doorway. "Miss Whitfield." "Mr. Callahan." "You walked 9 miles in the snow for this job," he said. "I did." "Then you'd better stay warm," he said, "because I'm going to need you here past spring." He walked out. Maggie stood alone in his office for a moment in the warmth of a house that had in 7 days gone from a doorway and a desperate chance to something that felt not like home yet, but like the beginning of the road that led there. She squared her shoulders. She went back to work. Silas did not go quietly. Rowan found him at the bunkhouse that same evening, and whatever was said between them carried through the cold, well enough that Tommy heard it from the stable, and Diego heard it from the water trough. And every man on the property understood by supper time that something had broken and wasn't going to be repaired. Maggie was at the stove when Silas came through the back door of the kitchen. She didn't turn around. "You did this," he said. "You did this," she said. "I just found the paperwork." He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that had weight to it, and she turned around then, because she had learned in 34 years that you did not let a man like Silas stand behind you when he was in that kind of quiet. He looked at her the way men looked at things they'd underestimated and couldn't forgive themselves for underestimating. "You think you won something. I think the ranch has enough feed to get through winter now," she said. "That's all I think. You've been here 8 days. 7. And you already think you know how things work here." "I know how feed invoices work," she said. "And I know how men like you work. You find a place that's a little distracted, a little undermanned, and you make yourself comfortable in the gap." She held his gaze. The gaps closed. Silas took 1 step toward her, and the kitchen door opened and Rowan walked in. He didn't say anything. He just stood in the doorway and looked at Silas with an expression that needed no translation whatsoever. Silas picked up his hat from the table. He looked at Maggie one more time. "A woman like you always ends up alone," he said, "one way or another." "Get off my property," Rowan said. Quiet, absolute. Silas walked out. The door closed behind him. The kitchen was very still for a moment, and then Eli appeared from the hallway, where he had clearly been listening, and said, "Good riddance," with the solemn conviction of an 8-year-old delivering a verdict. "Go wash up for supper," Rowan said. "I already—" "Eli." The boy went. Rowan looked at Maggie. "You all right?" "Fine," she said. "He was trying to rattle me. Men like that always try to rattle you on the way out. It's all they have left." She turned back to the stove. "Supper's in 20 minutes." He stood there a moment longer than necessary, and she was aware of it, that extra beat of attention, and she kept her eyes on the pot and said nothing further, and after another moment he left. She exhaled. 20 minutes later, she fed 9 men, and not one of them mentioned Silas by name, which told her more about how they felt about him than anything they could have said out loud. The supply order from Garrett arrived on a Thursday 3 days ahead of schedule, and Tommy rode back from Pueblo grinning like he'd personally negotiated a peace treaty. The quantities were correct. The pricing was fair. Maggie checked every line of the invoice against the delivery, wrote out the confirmation, and set it on Rowan's desk without fanfare. He came to find her in the kitchen that afternoon. "Garrett threw in an extra 1/4 ton on the grain," he said. "Why?" "Because I wrote him a letter telling him Callahan Ranch was looking for a long-term supplier relationship and would be recommending him to 3 other ranches in the valley if the first order went well." She didn't look up from the bread she was kneading. "Was that overstepping?" A pause. "No," he said. "Good." Another pause. "What 3 ranches?" "Henderson Alcott and the Morrow Place on the South Fork. Bess mentioned all 3 as honest operations." She looked up now. "I haven't contacted any of them. That was a negotiating position, not a promise. I wouldn't make a promise like that without your authorization." Rowan looked at her for a moment with that particular expression she was starting to recognize, the one where he was recalibrating something internally and hadn't decided yet whether to let her see it. "You could contact them," he said. "If you wanted to." "I'll draft the letters this week," she said. He nodded once and left. Cole appeared in the kitchen doorway approximately 30 seconds later, which told her he'd been standing in the hallway. He was the oldest of the remaining crew, methodical Cole, with his careful plate loading and his 15 years on this ranch, and he looked at her now with an expression that had shifted meaningfully from the careful blankness of the first morning. "You write a good letter," he said. "I write an excellent letter." He said, and walked away, and she understood that from Cole this was essentially a standing ovation. Friday, she went to town. She needed it for practical reasons. A supply list, a contact at the dry goods store, a conversation with the postmaster about the ranch's correspondence. Rowan offered Tommy as an escort. She told him she'd been going to towns alone for 15 years and would manage, and something in his expression suggested he wanted to argue about this, but couldn't construct a reasonable objection fast enough, so he didn't. Harlow's Creek was small, the way most Colorado towns were small, built with the intention of growing, and then having grown just enough to get comfortable and no further. She felt the attention settle on her the moment she stepped off the wagon she'd caught a ride on from the ranch road. She was used to attention. She had never in her life had the kind of body that allowed her to move through a space without being noticed, and she had made her peace with this the same way she'd made her peace with most things, not by pretending it didn't exist, but by refusing to let it determine the size of the room she was allowed to occupy. The dry goods store was run by a man named Alderman, who had the face of someone who'd been mildly disappointed by every transaction he'd ever made. He looked at Maggie's supply list, looked at her and said, "You're the woman out at Callahan's." "Margaret Whitfield," she said. "I'm managing the household." "Heard about that." He said it in the tone people used when what they'd heard wasn't complimentary. "Then you've heard correctly." She set the list on the counter. "I'd like to open a standing account for the ranch's household supplies. I can provide a letter of authorization from Mr. Callahan." Alderman looked at the list, then at her. "We don't extend credit to—" He stopped. "To what?" she said. He recovered poorly. "To new accounts without a full season's reference. Then I'll pay cash today and bring the letter next week." She pulled out the household funds she'd been given, counted the correct amount, and set it on the counter before he'd finished calculating. "Exactly right," she said. "You'll find." He counted it. It was exactly right. She took her supplies and walked out, and she heard the two women outside the door go quiet as she passed, and she kept walking because she had been hearing silences like that her whole life, and not one of them had ever actually stopped her from going where she needed to go. She was halfway to the post office when one of the women called after her. "Miss—" A pause. "Miss Whitfield, is it?" She turned. The woman who had spoken was perhaps 60, small and sharp-eyed, with the look of someone who'd survived hard years through the particular combination of stubbornness and social intelligence that frontier women developed or didn't. The woman beside her was younger, maybe 40, watching with the cautious neutrality of someone who hadn't yet decided which side of a situation she was on. "It is," Maggie said. "I'm Clara Alderman," the older woman said. "That's my husband's store." "I know. You handled him well." She said it without particular warmth, but without hostility either. Direct, appraising. He gives that speech about references to every woman who comes in without a man beside her. Half of them leave. She paused. "You didn't." "I had the correct amount," Maggie said. "There wasn't much to argue about." Clara Alderman studied her for a moment. "Rowan Callahan's a fair man," she said finally. "His wife was a good woman. The ranch has had a hard few years." She glanced at her companion and then back at Maggie. "People talk. You understand that?" "People always talk," Maggie said. "I've found the best answer to it is doing good work and letting the results speak." A silence. Then Clara Alderman said, "Come by for coffee on Wednesday if you're in town again. I'd like to hear about your time at Rafter J. My niece is looking for a position, and I want to know what to advise her." It was not friendship, not yet, but it was a door left open, and Maggie understood doors. "I'll try to make it Wednesday," she said. She was at the post office collecting the ranch correspondence when the door opened behind her, and she heard the postmaster's voice go careful in the particular way voices went when someone important or unpleasant had walked in. She turned. The man was dressed better than anyone had a right to be in Harlow's Creek in January. Dark coat, clean boots, a leather case under one arm. He had the particular smoothness of a man who spent most of his time in rooms where other people were not entirely comfortable. He looked at Maggie, the way men like him always looked at women like her, a quick dismissal,